An upscale city known for its luxury resorts, fine dining, and above all, safety. But it's also home to one of the most gruesome crimes in recent history, the brutal stabbing death of 29-year-old Lauren Heike.
It was so violent and it was so unexpected for this area that it seemed to scare people in a way that other crimes haven't.
Her murder, a shock to the normally safe community of Scottsdale, Arizona, and to the nation. Heike went for a walk last April on a popular hiking trail near her apartment, but she never returned. Her body was found with 15 stab wounds, some defensive, showing she tried to fight off her attacker. The investigation soon led to a prime suspect, 23-year-old Zion Teasley, and now that same suspect is facing new charges.
And this person, the type of crime fit, the type of weapon fit, and the description of the attacker fit.
Meanwhile, he's still awaiting trial for Heike's murder and a very serious possible consequence.
It's interesting to see Arizona and Maricopa County send this type of message that that we want this young man to be punished and we want the death penalty.
To understand what lies ahead for Zion Teasley and his newest charges, we have to head back to April 28th of last year. It was about 10:30 that morning when Lauren Heike began her walk on a popular trail along the north side of Phoenix in Scottsdale. Nearly 24 hours later, Phoenix police received a call for an injured person along the trail. When first responders arrived, they found Heike's body in an area off the trail that wasn't easily visible from the main path. Almost immediately, it was clear that Heike had been murdered. Officials say that she'd been walking along the trail when she was attacked from behind. She was stabbed 15 times, and some of her wounds were defensive, showing she tried to get away. Officials say it's possible that she did get away because she may have climbed over a nearby barbed wire fence. Even so, her injuries were too severe, and Heike was pronounced dead on the scene. In the days after Heike's murder, Phoenix police released this surveillance video showing a person of interest in the case. At the same time, detectives used DNA found on Heike's shoe to link a suspect to the crime, 23-year-old Zion Teasley. Investigators say there was such a quick turnaround because Teasley's DNA was already in the system. In fact, he'd just been released from prison 5 months before Heike's murder on multiple charges like disorderly conduct and armed robbery. Officials say Teasley may have watched Heike before the murder and even admitted he was the person on the surveillance video before backtracking and saying he wasn't sure. On top of all that, he made a puzzling comment to investigators, saying he wanted to look like her. At the time of Heike's murder, he was living with his mother, only about a mile from where her body was found. Investigators also learned he'd been fired from his job just 1 week before the murder. The reason? He was being too aggressive to women. Teasley was arrested on May 4th, 2023, and later indicted by a grand jury on charges of first-degree murder. He's pleaded not guilty. Since then, Maricopa County prosecutors have announced they plan to seek the death penalty when Teasley's case heads to trial next fall. But just this week, Teasley was slapped with 2 new charges of aggravated assault and burglary. It's from an unrelated incident that allegedly happened back in 2020, but the details of the incident are strikingly similar to Heike's. Criminal defense attorney Adam Conta explains how investigators were able to tie Teasley to this new case.
And I feel like this was an interesting pattern of police work in that they saw what happened to Miss Heike and that she had been kind of chased down and stabbed and murdered. And then they kind of went back, it seems like, through their case log and saw, well, what other cases that we have fit this profile? And so they went back to the victim in this 2020 case on this new arrest and said, hey, we think this matches, and it also matches the description, and then kind of put him in a lineup. And then that's ultimately what got to this new arrest. I mean, this person, the type of crime fit, the type of weapon fit, and the description of the attacker fit, but they just hadn't had any luck narrowing in on who they felt an actual suspect was. So it was interesting to see the police kind of work backwards in this case to get this arrest.
Investigators haven't publicly revealed the name of the victim in that 2020 incident, but they have provided some details. According to officials, the attack happened in January 2020. The woman was just getting home to her apartment when Teasley allegedly forced his way in. He stabbed the woman with a knife. according to prosecutors, before she was able to fight him off, and then he ran away. This attack happened just several months before Teasley's other charges were brought on, the ones that led to his plea deal and prison sentence. We're talking a lot about the parallels between the crimes that he had already been convicted of, the ones he's accused of in the Heike case, and then this new 2020 victim, the allegations that they're bringing forward there. And the parallels are pretty stark in that he used the same weapon, allegedly a knife, similar MO with the victim. So is it possible that things could have ended differently for this 2020 victim? I mean, Lauren Heike eventually was murdered. Is this something that could have happened here?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like all but for the ferocity of her fighting that it would have. Because what's interesting about these cases is that neither the Heike case or this one that is now coming to light seem like they're sexually motivated. And I think normally in a case like this, and especially one that the media grabs onto, that's at least a main component, a main motivating factor. That doesn't seem like it was at play here. And there's even been questions whether or not he was wrestling with his sexuality, or what his identity was at the time, because he said that he kind of like wanted to look like Lauren Heike, and there doesn't seem to be any evidence of any sexual attack in nature. And so, this current one, it sounds like this woman was pushed into her apartment, stabbed a few times, but ultimately fought him off, and successfully so, thank God, that she was able to get away. Heike, I believe, tried to do that. Lauren Heike tried to do that. There's plenty of evidence that she tried to run, that she hopped over a fence, which is kind of part of the evidence that connected him back to the case. And so she certainly gave a valiant effort and tried to flee and tried to get away from her attacker, but she was stabbed 15 times. And what we don't know, the order in which those stabbings took place and which one was first. And it just could have been, or was, physically impossible for her to fight her way out of this situation, especially out in a field or out in a trail where there was no one around to help. But it sounds like she certainly tried. But just in this 2020, the woman was able to do it.
After Heike's murder, Phoenix investigators put two and two together that the 2023 murder had a similar story to this 2020 attack. So they brought in the victim who survived the attack in 2020. She was able to pick Teasley out of a lineup. The lineup is really what stood out to me because that's when the 2020 victim pointed out the suspect, which led to his charges. But is that enough? I mean, evidently it is for prosecutors to move forward with these charges, but is that something that could hold up down the line?
Well, I mean, it's something they definitely have to be wary of because you have, I mean, the case that he's currently charged with, the Heike case, is so high profile and it's all over the news. And so a defense attorney will say, well, yeah, she picked him out of a lineup because she'd been looking at him on the news for the last year, for the last several months. And so, of course, he looked familiar. And so I think there's a lot there that would put the identification in question. But if you look at the type of crime it was, that it was a burglary and kind of a push-in burglary that was meant to lead to a very violent crime. This woman was stabbed several times with a knife that's similar to the same one used at the current crime. And so there is certainly plenty of circumstantial evidence, but I think they're going to need more than just kind of, well, this crime fits, and then we have a lineup. I think they're going to need to connect those dots a bit more.
What would be the ideal evidence then for prosecutors to be able to connect this suspect with the 2020 crime?
DNA. I mean, if they had any DNA that they can then go and match up to him, then that would be, I think, ball game. But quite honestly, I mean, that's how he got arrested on the Heike case, right? Because there was some DNA left on a shoe that was in the database already because of a previous robbery that he had done. But, there's so much circumstantial evidence here, not just in terms of the nature of the crime, but also, I mean, his previous case, when he murdered Lauren Heike, or at least when he allegedly did, he had only been out of prison for 5 months, and he had done like 3 years or 2.5 years. But that was for the press kind of conflates it. They say some articles will say disorderly conduct, some will say robbery. Well, it was three separate incidents. It was a robbery, an attempted robbery, and a disorderly conduct. But that was kind of a spree he was on. And those all allegedly took place, or all took place, I should say, because he pled guilty to them in May, June, and July, I think, of 2020. And this new attack that he's being charged with is in January of 2020. So not only does it fit the pattern, but it's also in the timeline that makes sense of kind of when he was acting out in this manner.
This story is especially gruesome and unfortunately is one of many we cover here on Law and Crime. But the reason we're able to bring you these stories is because of our sponsors. So I wanted to share about one of our sponsors now. That's City Lips. I started using City Lips and truly am in love. I've seen results in as little as 30 seconds. But it's not just me. Over 2 million women have tried City Lips too. I think it's really a game changer because City Lips is the ultimate all-in-one solution. It adds moisture, but has a great look to boot. So right now you can get 15% off City Lips with the code LAW15 or go to citybeauty.com/LCnews. So we've established that the 2020 attack and Lauren Heike's murder were somewhat similar, but there were also those crimes in the middle of both attacks. In July 2020, Teasley was charged with third-degree burglary, armed robbery, kidnapping, and disorderly conduct. So Teasley took a plea deal, pleading guilty to those 3 charges, and in exchange, prosecutors dropped the charges on 10 other serious felonies. He spent 16 months at the Red Rock Correctional Facility. At the end of his sentence, prosecutors classified Teasley as a minimum low risk to reoffend. Teasley was then released in November 2022. 5 months before Lauren Heike's murder. So if we're going back to some of the things you've been discussing prior, I want to really focus in on that prior conviction, disorderly conduct, several other things that were kind of all lumped together. And he served more than a year in prison, but was just released 5 months before Lauren Heike's murder. So a lot of people are pointing to that, saying maybe he should have been behind bars still at this point. I mean, if that was possible, she could still be alive. But how does that work? I mean, he served his time and they decided that he could be released at that point. So how does any of that work?
Well, they said that they're going to go back and review the nature of that plea agreement. But listen, that's a really slippery slope. And we do not live, nor should we live, in the movie Minority Report, where we're punishing people for crimes we think they're going to commit. That's not how our system works, and it's not how our system should work. And it's really easy to take situations like this and say, well, this guy, he committed a robbery, and so obviously people should have known he was about to go out and go on a murdering spree. And I guess the reality is that the robbery and attempted robbery that he was convicted of were actually after this first alleged attack took place. But the police didn't know that then, the DAs didn't know that then, and the defense attorneys didn't know that then. And so everyone got together and looked at a person who really had not a big record at the time, who had been a Marine, who had dropped out, and who clearly was struggling in life and had made some really bad choices and some violent choices. And so a plea for a few years in prison for those crimes doesn't seem totally unreasonable to me. It seems unreasonable now, looking back in hindsight, knowing what he did and possibly what he did before that. But we can't start turning around and saying, well, you got to give harsher sentences to people because they're going to commit crimes in the future.
Conta says it's easy to point to the severity of Teasley's charges now, but it's all in hindsight. At the time of his release, no one knew he was going to allegedly offend again.
It honestly goes like against every fiber of my being as a defense attorney who believes very heavily that a big part of why crimes happen are not because people are inherently bad. It's because there's mental illness, there's drug addiction. There are these things that are treatable problems or just problems that no one has ever taken the time to address. And so often when people get the treatment they need and get the help they need, they are able to come back into society and they are able to be contributing members. And so, yes, this is a terrible, terrible situation. And I don't begrudge Lauren Heike's family for thinking that this was a unbelievable plea deal that never should have happened in the first place. But if you look at it in context with all the factors that everyone was working with at the time he took that plea, it seems like it was reasonable.
The way that you're breaking it down is definitely understandable because at the time, attorneys didn't have any foresight to what was going to happen. But now looking back, we have a pattern of abuse, or at least some of the allegations, and a lot of similarities down to the weapon, potentially the victim. A lot of things are kind of lining up with parallels here. But that leads into my next question about prior bad acts. So we have a pattern, but can any of this be admissible? Is this something that will be discussed in the future trial of Lauren Heike's murder? What do you think?
Well, it depends. It depends. If he testifies, I think there's a strong likelihood that at least some of it would come in. Probably, certainly that he was convicted of a prior felony. That would probably come in. If he doesn't take the stand, if he chooses not to take the stand, then there's a very good chance that his entire criminal record will not be made part of the trial, and that the jury would never know that. But a jury is not supposed to convict someone, again, based on propensity, meaning that they're just because they did something in the past or even a couple things in the past, that they're more likely to have done this thing, and so you should convict them based on that likelihood. That's not how it works. You got to convict people based on the evidence of this particular case, of each particular crime. Now, there are ways around that a little bit. If there's a common scheme or plan, which is kind of like what you're saying, that these crimes are so similar in nature that this is the sort of a predator's MO. And so if they can establish that he has this MO, knife, women, overpowering them, then they might be able to get it in that way by showing a pattern. And also then if he testifies, they can impeach him with any prior bad acts unless they're kept out. But I think the judge would probably give some latitude on this.
As Kanta points out, the legal system sometimes works slowly, so this new case with the alleged 2020 attack could still be ongoing when the Lauren Heike case heads to trial.
Now, if this case is the Lauren Heike case is scheduled to go to trial in October of 2025. This new case we're just learning about today, August 14th, 2024. The reality is that if that case goes to trial in October of 2025, this case could still be ongoing. And if the case is ongoing, then accusations are proof of nothing. And so you wouldn't be able to use an accusation or an arrest against someone without a conviction, more than likely, because a prior bad act, even in the Weinstein trial, that's like the most famous example of using prior bad acts and when to and not to. The problem there was that there were prior bad acts that were allowed to come in that weren't even part of a criminal trial. And so again, those are kind of accusations. And the end result of that was that one of the most famous trials in the last 50 years was overturned. And so I think everyone is really, really careful about that now. And judges are even more cautious about letting in kind of prior bad act and bad act testimony to try to help a prosecutor convict someone.
With all this in mind, it's possible the jury in the Lauren Heike case never even hears about this alleged 2020 attack.
And so even though as we talk about it now, it seems like, well, yeah, of course, the jury should hear about all this. This is what this guy does. He goes out, he finds women, he stabs them, and he does these horrible, terrible, violent acts. The reality is that legally speaking, the prosecutor should be confined with the evidence that was specifically used for Lauren Heike. And for this 2020 case, it would be probably more than likely confined to whatever evidence is going to be admissible just for that. Because also keep in mind for the 2020 case, the one that's brand new, all these other acts happened after. So it's hard to use acts that happened afterwards too to show that something prior was more likely to have taken place.
But if we're looking ahead to the Heike case, a major question is what sort of defense Teasley will bring. You mentioned that the Lauren Heike case is headed to trial in October 2025, so we still have a significant amount of time, but you also touched on whether the defendant will take the stand. Now, as a defense attorney, what do you think the discussions are going to look like? Obviously, it's up to the defendant. He is the one who will decide whether he will take the stand at all. But you have the background of a defense attorney. What do you think those conversations would look like between the attorney and the client?
This is one of those cases where I can't know obviously what they talk about privately with attorney-client privilege, but as a defense attorney, you are not allowed to put known perjury on the stand. It's like the number one rule we have. And so there are plenty of ways to work within those guidelines, meaning that if I know a client did it, but that they just really want to go to trial because they don't think that they are going to be found guilty, I can't say to a jury, he didn't do it. I can say the evidence doesn't prove this case, though, beyond a reasonable doubt. And, from my understanding of the facts here, Zion told officers that that was him on the video, the second clip running away from where Lauren Heike was discovered, and said he wanted to look like her. And so there are things that I think would make it very, very difficult for him to testify. I don't see a scenario where he gets up on that stand and has a story that would explain um, really any part of what he was doing there, why his DNA was on his shoe, why the cell phone data puts him there, why the video shows him running away, and then the statements he made. Even something along the lines of, well, if I ever killed someone, it wouldn't be premeditated. That's not a quote, but it's close.
In the end, it's really Teasley who gets to make the final decision.
And so every defendant has the right to testify, and there's certainly been trials where I thought that I had these trials sewn up. I thought I already had an acquittal in the bag, and I told my defendants, "You do not need to testify. Do not testify. I would like you not to testify." But as you said, it's one of the few things that we just don't control. We don't control whether a client pleads guilty or goes to trial, and we can't control whether they want to testify or not. That's their constitutional right, and they have every right to get up on the stand and tell their story, even if it's ultimately going to hurt them. And so I don't see a scenario as I look at the facts in front of me now in which it would make sense for him to testify, but that's just a conversation that he and his attorneys are going to have.
Yeah, that's definitely something to keep an eye out for as this moves forward. But another one of the things we're looking out for too is the death penalty. I mean, this is something that prosecutors have announced that they're moving forward with. This is the most severe penalty that we have here in the United States, and it's reserved for the most severe crimes. So what do you think went into prosecutors determining that that's the route they want to take, and how will that make things different than a normal trial?
Well, I think there are a couple things I think that went into this. There is the fact that that Lauren Heike's murder was egregiously heinous, that she was stabbed 15 times. Um, but it's also sort of, to me, it says maybe we screwed up in the past. It might be Arizona saying that, in the respect that maybe they wish they had given him a harsher sentence in the past. And I still agree. I still mean what I said before, that I think every case and every defendant should be evaluated by what's in front of them, not what you think is going to happen in the future. But the death penalty is really, really rare. In Arizona, it's hardly ever used. Since 2014, there's only been 3 people executed in Arizona, and all 3 were in 2022. And so there's multiple years where no one is executed. This isn't something that just comes along and they use flippantly. I think it's because of the nature of the crime, also because he's got a history of doing dangerous acts, and that can be one of the factors. Um, and also just a message to the public. So I think it's threefold. The message to the public isn't part of the determining process that the Maricopa County Attorney's Office used, but the dangerousness and the heinousness are, and the fact that it as a message that's sent out to the public, like, listen, we take this seriously. We think that the nature of his crimes are inexcusable, and we don't ever want this person on the street under any circumstance. So I think those are really the things that went into determining that.
Maricopa County prosecutors announced they're seeking the death penalty against Teasley back in December of last year, but her trial isn't until October of next year. That major time gap, Conta says, is out of the ordinary.
I think it's really interesting that they announced so far in advance that they were going to seek the death penalty. It's not something I see happen that often, and it's still kind of a controversial method of punishment. There's really no evidence that the death penalty does anything to stop people from committing those acts. There's some crimes where a heavy prison sentence is meant to deter the public as much as anything else. There's pushing someone in the subway, for instance. You might get a harsher sentence because they really want people to know that if you do crimes like this, you're going to not just be punished, but really punished. Generally speaking, there's no evidence that someone about to commit a heinous crime like a murder really pauses or does anything or thinks about the punishment on the other end. So, to me, what's interesting is that even though he was just indicted on this case for the 2020 attack, and that the Lauren Heike murder trial is still over a year away, to me, it's It's interesting to see Arizona and Maricopa County send this type of message that that we want this young man to be punished and we want the death penalty. To put it that far in advance gives kind of the community a time to let that sink in.
And in the end, it's the severity of Heike's murder that led prosecutors to make their decision.
What's interesting about the Lauren Heike case is just how it shook up that community. It was so violent and it was so unexpected for this area that it seemed to scare people in a way that other crimes haven't. So even though the death penalty might never be imposed on this young man, even if he's found guilty of everything, I think as much as anything, it's trying to be a security blanket to the consciousness of the public.
These new charges against Teasley were filed on July 19th, and he's set to appear in court again on August 30th. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.